Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're so excited to have you, and I'm so excited for the opportunity to open up today's conversation on the growing Latinx representation gap. Just gonna see if anyone else is joining us. All right. We're going to go ahead and get started. And I do want to point out, we do have live Spanish interpretation available. If you click on your Zoom menu on the little globe icon, you can access the Spanish translation. Si necesita servicios de interpretación en español, puede hacer clic en el menú para seleccionar acceso a la interpretación. All right. So I'm going to start by introducing myself. And at Promise 54, we like to do what we call radically human introductions, meaning we like to do introductions that push beyond our titles and credentials, and the work that we do, and to really pull out what truly feels important to us, what shapes us. And for me, that has to start with my parents. So my name is Lucerito Ortiz. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am based in Los Angeles, California, where I was born and raised. And I am the proud daughter of immigrant parents. My mother, Yolanda Ortiz, is from Guatemala. My father, Dionisio Ortiz, is from Mexico. And my mom is a house cleaner, and you see a photo of her in action here. And my father is a gardener. And I grew up helping my mother clean houses. And from a very young age, I would observe the way that her clients spoke to her. And I would, when I was really little, I started off feeling a little uncomfortable. And as I grew older, that discomfort shifted to frustration and anger, because I realized it was clear to me by their tone, by their language, sometimes in subtle ways, sometimes in blatant ways, that people didn't seem to recognize or honor my parents' full humanity, their courage, their resilience, their brilliance, their intelligence. And my parents never had the opportunity to pursue education in the ways that they wanted. My mom always dreamed of going to college, but didn't have the opportunity to do so in her home country. And my father had to stop his education after the 3rd grade because his family couldn't afford to have him in school. And actually, this photo of me and my father is in front of my father's elementary school in his pueblo in Mexico. So coming to this country, my parents viewed education as our golden ticket, as our pathway, as their children's pathway to social mobility. And I grew up deeply grateful for the sacrifices that so many people in my life made for the sake of my educational experiences. And as I grew older, I also became increasingly frustrated that so many sacrifices had to be made in order for that to be true. And it was through the love and support of so many in my life that I found myself at Harvard College as a first-generation college student. And it was at Harvard that I learned the difference between access and inclusion. That simply being in a place does not necessarily mean you feel of a place. And my parents, for all of their sacrifices and pride in having me there, their daughter attend Harvard, they never wanted to attend any Harvard events because they felt so out of place. They felt so uncomfortable. They felt the same way that they did with their clients. And fundamentally, my commitment to this work of diversity, equity, and inclusion comes from a deep desire to create spaces where my parents can walk in and feel fully seen, fully accepted, fully valued. And I've always known and felt that my parents deserve that for all they have done, and also just for the simple fact that they are human. And I have more recently connected with the idea that I deserve that too. Knowing that we all do. We all deserve spaces that honor us, honor our full humanities, our full identities. And this is why I feel so honored to get to work for an organization like Promise 54. Our mission is to do just that, to create spaces where adults can fully thrive and be their full human selves, bring their brilliance and talents to bear in service of the work that we all do and the missions that we all work to serve and live out. We believe that DI is a precondition for social justice, and that in order to fully live out those missions, As social justice organizations, we have to do this work internally as well. So at Promise Before, we support organizations through tailored support, through shared cohort experiences on DEI and talent work, and also through research, which is what brings us to this conversation today. We released our first Unrealized Impact Report in 2017 based on data from 5,000 individuals across 200 organizations. And we wanted to understand, how is the education sector doing on DEI? Before then, we didn't have an aggregated data set across the sector to give us insight as to what was going on. And now with this 2.0 report, we have expanded our data set to over 28,000 individuals across over 500 organizations. And it is the largest study of its kind on DEI in the field of education, and we hope represents a bold call to action for organizations to engage in the work of becoming diverse, inclusive, equitable, and anti-racist. So as we looked at the data across the report, there were various themes that began to emerge. And one of those themes was this idea of underrepresentation of students and people of color in education. We as a society and as a sector have been talking a lot about the importance of racial and ethnic diversity, especially in the last year and a half, 2 years. But what we have not been doing, it seems, is meaningfully moving the needle on these metrics. When we look at the proportion of students of color served by organizations in our sample, we saw 80% of students served by these organizations are students of color, yet only 53% of staff are staff of color. And then that percentage narrows as you move up the positional hierarchy in organizations. You see fewer and fewer numbers of staff of color moving into leadership positions. And what we also saw is that this representation gap was the largest for the Latinx population. While Latinx students are 40% of students in our sample, by the time you get to leadership positions, that's only 8% of organizational leaders in our sample. And given that the Latinx population will continue to grow, right? The Latinx community represented 52% of the population growth over the last decade. This gap, this representation gap, is only going to continue to grow unless we actively work to disrupt it and to narrow it. And so that's the conversation we wanted to invite today. So we have 5 amazing leaders joining us. I'm so excited to hear their experiences, their brilliance on this topic. So I'll do some quick introductions before handing over to them. So first we have Dr. Nancy Gutierrez, who is president and CEO of the Leadership Academy, a nationally recognized nonprofit organization dedicated to cultivating culturally responsive leadership in school system leaders. We have Mirna Castrejon, President and CEO of the California Charter School Association, whose mission is to meet parent, educator, and community need for great public school options by supporting and advocating for high-quality nonprofit charter schools and sharing their success throughout California's public schools. Veronica Crespin-Palmer is the co-founder and CEO of RISE Colorado. RISE is centered around family engagement and community organizing in Aurora, as families and students lead the movement for educational equity. RISE works to educate, engage, and empower low-income families and families of color to rise as change agents for educational equity in the public school system. We have Devin Teran, who is the Director of Partnerships and Advocacy for Revolución Educativa, where he advocates for meaningful and sustainable change to support Latinx educators and families. And he is also an appointed board member of the Kansas Works Workforce Development Board. And we have Alma Velasquez, who serves as principal at the Jason Lee Elementary School in Northeast Portland, where she has served as an educator for over 13 years. So I'm going to start by inviting each of you, stop my share by inviting each of you to introduce yourselves in your own radically human way to your comfort. And then we'll open up sort of a panel discussion. So I'll start, how about we start, we'll go in that same order. How about we start with Nancy?
All right, well, good to be here. Hey, everyone. Thanks for having us and for inviting us into this conversation. So let's see, I love that idea, by the way, of a radically human introduction that goes beyond titles and I mean, what do titles really say anyway, right? So I'll give you a few vignettes of my nieces and nephews. My nephew Adam, he's a pre-K student in Los Baños. It is November 11th today, and he has been sent home from school 15 times since the start of school for taking off his mask and repeating the words the teacher says. So that's one. Number two, my niece Malena, she's in San Jose, California, and she came 1 minute late to her Zoom because everyone was on quarantine. And because of that, she had to go into a waiting room by herself for 45 minutes and couldn't participate in art class. And then was brought back into full group where everyone's sharing their art. She doesn't have any art. Of course, she's sad. She's only like 6 years old. And they were like, come on time next time. And then the third vignette is my niece, Ava, who is in high school and who unfortunately was jumped by 5 students and was hospitalized for a few days. It was obviously very traumatic for our family. We get her back into school and she was met with suspension notice versus how are you doing? Are you okay? And so I bring just a lot of fights to you. I bring a lot of struggles. I bring a lot of like, here's kind of what we're up against. The good news though, and the hope in this introduction is that in each of those cases, you know, now that we're a couple generations in, we know how to advocate for ourselves. And so, but whether it's calling meetings with the principal, calling an SST, asking for full assessments, you know, whether it's saying, nope, we're not going to accept the suspension. We're doing things radically different than maybe we were done when I was a kid in school, labeled a troublemaker and wasn't able to advocate for myself. And so I bring that to you as both things that continue to happen within our Latinx community over and over every single day, and also some hope about what we're learning as a community and ways we're learning to advocate for ourselves and to say, nope, not okay, ain't gonna happen no more. So I'm Nancy Gutierrez, President and CEO of the Leadership Academy.
Thank you so much, Nancy, for sharing. Mirna, would love to hear from you next.
Buenos días, o serán buenas tardes. Hello, everyone. My name is Mirna Castrejón. Soy mexicana de raíz. I grew up in Mexico and immigrated to the US alone at the age of 17 to come to college as an adult English language learner. I am a single mom to an amazing biracial high school aged musician son who has now earned for me a new identity hat, and that is band mom, because that's a thing. I'm an adopted Angelina. I first immigrated to the US to the Midwest, spent 13 years in the Midwest, then escaped to Texas, searching and yearning for a deeper connection to community. And that's where my education advocacy path really began, where I did some really transformative work for me as a volunteer community organizer with the Industrial Areas Foundation and their education initiatives. And I learned some really radical lessons about bringing your whole self, about the dictums of organizing, finding common interest, despite our multifaceted identities and access points to advocacy. I learned the important values of putting power before program and people before party. I became radically nonpartisan, and through that whole journey, ended up landing in Los Angeles, which is my adopted home. I've never felt more in home in my whole U.S. journey than becoming a full Californian. I believe this is the place where I feel most seen, most at home, as diverse and challenging as California can be, with so many problems yet to solve. It is home, and I've been here for a good 20 years already. So I am an organizer by vocation, by creed. I'm a practicing Buddhist and a mother of cats not dragons, cats. So for nearly 2 decades of the 3 in my professional journey, I joke that I am in my the third act of my profession. I've been committed to advancing the cause of public charter schools as vehicles, not as endgame, for advancing equity and access to high quality education that meets the needs of both students' gifts and challenges, especially in a state like California, where the largest single demographic group are Latinos, and being absolutely relentless about creating spaces where our students are just seen and acknowledged in all of their diverse identities, whether they are new immigrants, whether they're children of third or fourth generation, or whether the border moved on them and their families and they didn't cross this border, that they find an educational experience that lifts up their full humanity and gives them better access to opportunity, an opportunity that I only, in my early immigration years began to fully understand what a privilege it was to come here to gain better access to education. That's me.
Thanks so much, Minda. Veronica?
Good morning, everyone. Veronica Creston Palmer, co-founder and CEO of Rise Colorado. Thank you so much to Promise 54 for creating this very important report for us to learn and study from and understand what's happening in our nation. And thank you, Promise 54, for hosting this critical conversation. Really appreciate it. So I'm a Latina, I'm Chicana, I'm 7th generation Colorado native. On my dad's side, so like Mirna was saying, we did not cross the border crossed us. My family has been here in this country since it was Mexico. Again, on my dad's side. On my mom's side, my grandfather came from Morelia, Michoacan. When he was 13 as an unaccompanied minor, he crossed the Rio Grande on his brother Ezequiel's back and came as part of the Bracero program to be a farm worker, to send money back to Mexico to my great grandmother, and came with a 3rd grade education from Mexico. And always told me, Hita, education is everything. Make our family proud. Get your education, because I sacrificed a lot for our family to come to this country. Even with a 3rd grade education, he cut 2 albums. He was a famous banda mariachi singer here in Colorado. Beautiful singer. I still listen to his music on the regular to keep me motivated, inspired to keep going, especially during these perilous times of the pandemic and the racial reckoning happening in our country and world. I'm also a military wife. My husband is a Black man from the deep South in Georgia. So I have 2 beautiful Afro-Latino children, Trey and Aviana, who are 12 and 9, and who the system very much sees as Black and brown and treats them as such. Even though my husband and I have 4 degrees between us, we are constantly on the regular advocating for our children. When my son is told he's too aggressive, he's too competitive, even though he's a straight A student and an all-star athlete, his teachers see him as too aggressive and too competitive instead of a brilliant Black and brown boy. My daughter, who has been relentlessly bullied and called fat and stupid and not pretty, and supporting her as an Afro-Latina and her identity of being a strong Black and brown woman. And today is my grandmother Juanita's birthday. She would have been 87 today. She passed away in April. So really proud to bring her into this space, and just can't think of a better way to celebrate my grandmother Juanita Lucero, who is from the San Luis Valley here in Colorado. And just to think about our Latino community, because guess what? Nobody's coming to save us. And we have the resilience, power, and strength within ourselves to create the radical and transformative change we need here in the United States for our Latinx children and all of our children of color, so they receive the excellent education that they deserve. And we have the power within ourselves to make that change. So really excited for the conversation today, and thank you all for having me.
Thanks so much, Veronica. Devin?
Yeah, hi, thank you. I'm so glad to be here. I think maybe the most real thing I could say about myself is, after hearing each of your introductions, I just want to hang out. And I really want to I love to connect with people. So true to me, like, I'm at my best when I'm connecting with people and seeing connections and helping to forward the work of others. And so this is really exciting. And thank you for having me here. My own family story. I am the son of a Cuban immigrant and Pennsylvania Dutch mom, right? So, like, I feel like my life has been an experience in contradictions. And the fact that, like, my Cuban family left Miami to go to Wichita, Kansas, where there were 5 other Cuban families. And so, like, our Latino experience was like our family. And then I got to high school and I went to a high school that no ethnic group was larger than 38% of the school, and that was Latinos, where no group was more than half. It was truly a beautiful, diverse celebration of things that I've been chasing my entire life for my own girls. So I live in Kansas City. If you know a little bit about Kansas City, the state line is just a residential street that splits our metro. And so I walk my preschool daughter to Missouri for preschool, and then I walk back to Kansas for first grade for my other daughter. I live in the school district where I used to teach because I believe that's important to really. I don't think you have to live where you work, but I think you have to spend your life there in some real way. Your fate has to be tied up intimately with those you serve. You cannot do this kind of work from a distance. So for me, it's been a life of contradictions. Even think about representation. We'll get into that later. And what I've seen, and I think for my girls, I hope to live in a beautifully diverse, vibrant community full of the arts. You can also see, I want to hang out with the band moms and also your kids playing music, because you can see also this is a band guy, and I've got a gig tonight, so I've got to pack up after this and get loaded out for the show, but so glad to be here. Oh, my role is Director of Policy and Partnerships for Revolución Educativa. We're the 501c4 affiliate of the Latinx Educators Collaborative, so really advocating on state and local policy issues affecting our families and communities here. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Devin. And Alma. Did we lose her? All right. Well, we can circle back once we get her back.
She's on. She's trying to unmute herself.
Yeah.
So if Lucerito, if you can unmute her from your end, that might be helpful.
We can only ask to unmute. I can't. I think she froze as well. But we'll come back. I think once we get her back and her audio, we'll circle back. But thank you all so much for sharing these very generous parts of yourselves with us. Oh, there she is.
I'm here. I'm so sorry. I was fine until the moment of truth. So I just have to say, I am so honored to be here, and my heart is filling with joy in just being in this comunidad, because I am finding so many connections with every single story. I am a band mom as well. Middle school and high school, my daughter was in the wind ensemble, so I just have to say, you know, I've got that cred as well. My name is Alma Delia Velázquez Miranda, and I am an immigrant. I crossed the border into the United States with my family from Guadalajara, Mexico, aboard a 1970s Impala station wagon, carrying a dream for a better future and opportunities that generational poverty had not afforded my parents, Pompeyo and Amelia. I believe that it is that drive, literally, that binds me to my parents, because the fact that neither one had a chance to complete an elementary school education meant that their children would. My dad worked as a farm worker, also part of the Bracero program, and in agricultural jobs for over 30 years. 5 out of his 5 children became college graduates. And this is what my mom claims is her greatest accomplishment. I am a mom to Carmen, a bilingual, bicultural, biracial human who is a freshman at the University of Oregon this fall. My greatest belief and hope is that education changes lives, but not only for the doors that a degree will open for you, but also for the way that the Spanish version of the word educación changes you and your ability to move about the world with manners and grace for other human beings. Making this dream a reality for my students propels me out of bed each morning. Since I became a public school teacher and now serve as a public school principal in a neighborhood where most children are children of color, children of immigrants, or qualify for free and reduced lunch. I'm so excited to be here. Buenos dias.
Thank you so much. Gosh, it fills my heart so much to have the privilege of sharing space with all of you. And as we engage in conversation, I want to invite folks to engage in the chat and also surface questions that come up for you. We have like some starter questions, but would also like to elevate questions from the audience through the chat as we see where the conversation takes us. So first, I want to open up by asking, and please, folks, feel free to, panelists, feel free to unmute and just engage in conversation with each other. While I'm guessing the data was not surprising to you, what is your reaction to the data? What does this data make you feel and think? And how does the importance of Latinx representation resonate for you personally?
I think we have Nancy.
Nancy, you're muted.
My bad. I'll jump in by connecting with something that Devin, you said when you were doing your radically human introduction, which is you talked about like how we can't be so disconnected from the communities we serve, from our people, from our home. And I will tell you that a lot of that data for me, it's about access. It's about the lack of access. And by example, that would be that, you know, there's this narrative that we have in our communities that you have to leave to succeed, that if you show a glimmer of hope, a glimmer of potential, that you're like, yo, like, you know what, you're smart, you're not like these other people, you got to get out, man. Go here, go there, that side of town, this school, that community. And what we do is we, within our own community as well, we perpetuate this idea that there are a few people who are worthy, who are smart, who do well, and that they are worthy of this, and versus what should be happening, which is really about what does it mean to reinvest in us? What does it mean to, you heard these introductions, and they were all about the celebration of our comunidad, of our families, of what brought us here to this day. Like, that's a completely different narrative, the narrative of pride and of gratitude for who we are and our strength and our beauty and our intelligence, than it is to say, you are one of a few, get out and do us. So for me, it has to do with both like having access, but also this thing that is perpetuated within our communities about leaving to succeed, about getting out versus reinvested in our own and in ourselves.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Nancy. And you know, when I saw this data, there were a lot of questions that came up for me and a lot of feelings, and some are data points. One thing that you know, with my own experience, I have to recognize that I have a little bit of a very divergent experience with my lived experience as a student and then as a educator, which was that from the time I started 6th grade until even now, I have not had any white principals that I was a student under, and I've only had one white supervisor that I reported to. And so that entire time it's either been Latinx or Black leaders that I've reported to that entire time. But if I were to go back and look at the number of teachers that I had or worked with, it's incredibly small, right? And I'm also like, it's making me wonder also about, and like I fit this narrative as well of like, man, as soon as I was, you know, I don't think I was necessarily great as a teacher, but as soon as I was competent as a teacher, then it's like other roles. And I worry also about how we develop our teachers that are in the field, that are teachers of color. I worry about what we move them into, how many people that really would make amazing lifelong teachers get pushed into other areas because they're good with those kids. And so like there's this whole ecosystem here. My hope is that experience, it's one, like I don't want it to be a thing that gives me blinders, but also like, man, we can have these rich experiences because the talent is there. The talent exists. And I wish more systems had that experience.
Can I offer, I mean, the numbers are stark and disheartening. I want to flip it to the asset side. In the work that we've been doing recently with CCSA and looking at these issues of diversity, representation, and inclusion across our field, we about a year ago, we put out a study that we actually looked at the entire California student body and looked at the intersection between achievement and representation in teachers and school leaders. And while there are, massive, asterisks and caveats around the limitations of the data and the methodology, blah, 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 we're in a really weird data moment. Nonetheless, it was absolutely incontrovertible that we found these three connections. Students at schools with a leader of color score significantly higher on state tests, especially in high schools. Especially, that's like a dramatic jump. 12th grade students with a leader of color graduate significantly more prepared for college and career. It's not just about getting across the line, but coming out prepared. Like this articulation of experience and expectation and rigor and support for students who can be seen, that makes a difference. And we all know the data on this one, and we reaffirmed it as well, that on average, students, especially African-American students, but Latino students as well, in high school students that have a leader of color leading their school are significantly less likely to be suspended. So this creating of environments and ecosystems, it's not just about the, if you will, the soft elements of being seen and heard. It actually has a direct and determinate impact on student achievement. We have got to look at all of the elements of the pipeline. We still are saddled with ridiculous debt. The hoops that we make people jump through to get credentialed and in front of classrooms are in fact very prohibitive for our communities in every sense. And we have a tremendous opportunity to do something right now because the pandemic has absolutely disrupted those pipelines, those programs, the teacher, counselor, nurse, you name it. Teacher shortage is very real. And I hope that we seize on this opportunity by pointing to the gap and stepping up to find the solutions and radically transform this system that actually conspires against our people to get in front of the communities they need.
Thanks so much. So on that, so on this idea that, we have clear evidence that having representation has clear benefits for all students and especially students of color. And Devin, your point of like the talent is there, the talent exists. And so I'm curious, what do you see as some of the biggest barriers to increasing Latinx representation and access in education?
I would like to say that I think the biggest barrier is really the mental models that we have from the people in charge. Because honestly, as somebody said, being asset-based, I think that one of the things that we tried to do in Portland Public Schools a few years ago when I was a teacher trainer in the dual language department was to tap the human potential in our schools. We have hundreds, thousands of what we call paraprofessional classified employees who are native speakers, who have college degrees, we're not entering the teaching profession for whatever reason, for all those barriers that we know about, right? So tapping into that potential and creating a partnership with our local university and making a pathway for them to enter the teaching profession with training and support from a coach allowed us to grow that pipeline, and that continues to today. But there's so much work left to be done, and I think a lot of it is not just getting people in, but also how do we support them once they're there. I'm in my second year as a principal, and one of the things that is most valuable that I'm receiving this year is coaching, and I cannot tell you how coaching is helping me day to day realize my vision at my school. So I really think that it's more than just bringing the people in. It's leveraging their human talent and also supporting them along the way.
I agree with Alma, and to build off of that, we do have incredible, from our families to our students, we have incredible talent pipeline around us, surrounding us. But, there's real financial barriers. Families can't afford to pursue their associates, then bachelors, and all the other credentialing and tests you have to take to become, paraprofessionals or certified teachers. So those are real barriers and boundaries. In addition to that, think about how many undocumented families we have. In Aurora, where we work, we're 56% Latino in Aurora, and majority of our families are undocumented. And guess what? Many of them were educators in Mexico. Many of them have their degrees and have their credentials, but guess what? When they enter in the US, they are not acknowledged or recognized. And they are brilliant, genius educators. And I'm like, so guess what? If the traditional system won't acknowledge their degrees and their credentials and their years of experience, we as a nonprofit will acknowledge them. And we're trying to be creative. And how do we bring them into the fold to be tutors and the after school providers that our families so desperately need? But the school system keeps telling us there's no money for after school programming. There's no money for tutoring. We have all this talent around us who are trained and skilled, will be culturally relevant, are bilingual. But the United States and our education system does not recognize those skills, gifts, talents, credentials, or certifications, but we will. So trying to be creative too. If the system won't move, how do we organize and move the systems ourselves and bring this genius to the table so that students and families get the support they need and deserve, and the culture responsive education from our own community?
Veronica, there's so many things that, I wish we could have an hour-long conversation just on unpacking some of what you said there, because my mind's going in a million directions with that. But one thing I want to, first off, I think just the way that we value expertise in our culture and what that means and who that keeps in and who that keeps out is huge, right? So I want to recognize that. And part of this is also recognizing talent in a variety of ways. And we can't use policy and licensure to substitute for what is just the job of leadership of you got to develop talent and you got to get rid of people that aren't so good at it. I'm curious, we're in your district, the district I live in is 23,000 students. So it's one of the larger ones in Kansas City. But in over half of our students are Latino. I think it's about 60%. We have less than 60 teachers. I believe we're at 55 teachers that are Latinx. Mm-hmm. And our organization, in the last year did the work of going and finding all the teachers in the Kansas City region. We found that less than 1% identify Hispanic or Latinx. And in my county, in one of the largest districts with the highest percentage of Latinx students, there are 55 teachers. And we know them to the point, when one leaves the profession, our executive director's oh, so-and-so, he knew by name before we even said the name who it was. And I'm we have such a huge gap. So the other piece that was hit so true on that, the data was that of all of the students in our public school system, the least likely to have a teacher that shares their ethnicity or race are our Latinx students. Yeah. I'm seeing it play out in my home community, and it breaks my heart.
And yes, and we have to realize that when we talked about how students are more successful when they have representation, similar with adults, right? We have only, 7% of our superintendents in this country who are supes of color. Of that, less than 3% Latinx. And that's a trickle down. When you have leaders, when you have superintendents of color, guess what? You attract more principals of color, and you're going to keep them. And you have more principals of color, you're going to attract more teachers of color and keep them. And it's not only that. There's representation, and there is being culturally responsive in all that we do. Our students need it, but guess what? Our adults need it too. Our adults need it, our teachers need it, our principals need it. We work with school districts, across the country who are saying, I'm going to put a stake in the ground here. I'm going to create some affinity spaces, and I'm going to create some bridging spaces. And it's not going to be the most popular thing that I'm going to have a Black affinity group, I'm going to have a Latinx affinity group, so on and so forth. But I'm going to do it because I know that there's healing that needs to take place, and I want to really retain. Those are moves, right? Those are moves that need to happen so that we create that space.
I want to add to that because I absolutely agree with you. I was mentioning briefly my coach. So our school district received a grant to support leaders of color recently, multi-million-dollar grant. And part of that includes this coaching program. And the ability for me to have a coach who is a Latina, who has been a principal, and can speak to me about my identity, like how my identity, I can have those conversations with her about how my identity impacts my work. I have a mostly white staff. So identity is like every day in my life, right? So I have to show up with conversations between a white teacher and a Black family, or a white teacher and a Pacific Islander student, or a Latino family. And like every day, race plays a role. And so having a coach that can help, that can identify with me, is incredibly important for me.
I want to ask, sorry, I want to double click on this idea of like the role of identity in your experience. Michael earlier in the chat talked about like his experience as a teacher feeling pressure, the pressure of like the expectation around assimilation. And I'm curious, as you think about the role of your identity in your experience as a professional, as an educator personally, how have you experienced like your own navigation of culture, right? Like personal culture, dominant culture, and the role of identity in that experience?
Yeah, I would say teaching in East Los Angeles, because I started my teaching career in LA. My students were shocked. They're like, "You're brown? I've never had a brown teacher." Like they just hadn't seen that very often, even in Los Angeles. And, I was coming from Colorado, and I was like, "Wow." But they wanted to know what it meant to be a Colorado Latina versus being an Angelino. And so had really deep conversations with them around that, and how the system had not done any type of identity development for our children to know their genius and brilliance. And growing up in East Los, come on, the Chicano moratorium, the 1960 walkouts, they knew nothing of that. And how that is such a disservice to our children and our families to own and to know their incredible ancestry and history in that community alone. So we talked a lot about the walkouts, and this is kindergarten, y'all. They can do it at 5 and 6 years old. And because we were on Cesar Chavez Boulevard, like, come on, we have so much to learn about our culture and history around us. So that was really powerful. And also that I'm not fluent in Spanish because of white supremacy. My family was beaten for speaking Spanish here in Colorado. So my grandparents chose not to teach my parents. And now I'm on a long journey of learning Spanish for myself. So explaining that, being from the Southwest and the racism my family experienced, and why I lost my family's language, and how I'm trying to reclaim that. And in addition to that, thinking about how do we infiltrate the system at all levels, right? 100%, we need more school leaders of color, more teachers of color. We also need more nonprofit leaders of color to support the system. Because like Mirna was saying earlier, we need to bust the system. So at Rise, we believe in an inside-outside approach. You got to work in the system to change the system, and outside of the system to hold the system accountable. That's the community organizing piece that I think Mirna and I really love. So in that, how do we have more nonprofit leaders of color too in education? Like I was out there on my own, and then I met Xiomara and Amanda Fernandez, and we, support each other as Latinas and others trying to do this work to support our comunidad and the larger movement for educational equity. So I'm thinking about how do we have representation at all levels to infiltrate the system holistically, because we need to be inside the system representing and outside the system to really create that transformation our children deserve.
I just want to drive home that the idea there's not one type, right? And one of the beautiful things about trying to be inclusive in the classroom that when I was teaching was, man, like our kids might have an ethnic identity, but they also have very diverse interests and talents, and they are themselves, and they're so beautiful and unique. And I think one of the failures that schools get into is they try to address affinity groups as one type. And you know what, the type makes a lot of sense when we're looking at the macro level, but when you zoom in on a person, I mean, who would have thought that in our, authentic introduction, our radically authentic introduction, we would have all connected over like being band parents, right? Like who would have thought that, right? That would not have been an assumption if we had not been invited to be authentic to ourselves. And the invitation for staff to be authentic, for kids to be authentic, to be vulnerable with each other is so important. And I think where we fail on this, and the previous question about how do we support, right? We have to pay attention to those things, and we have to dedicate money to them, and intention to supporting the diversity, and intention to spending money on developing our diverse educators in all of their different fields, and giving them the permission to be their full selves instead of carrying the weight of being a token for culture.
Mhm.
That's a huge thing that drives so many people out of the field, is feeling the weight of being the token. And so like I'm thinking about all of these things, and Veronica, like I'm that kid that we also lost the language. It was Spanglish in our house with my abuelos, right? And it's okay, and it's a beautiful thing, and I've only been ashamed of it in some circles, but now that I step away from, I'm actually proud of what that meant. It was just,
Absolutely.
it was the reality of our lived experience. Now I would love to learn Spanish. I need to do the work on it, but also like it's just what the experience is, and it's part of my story, even if it doesn't fit with other stories.
Absolutely. Double plus two on that, Devin. For me, I mean, it's this recognition, right, that this intersectionality actually evolves over time as well. You can hear me now, right? Like I don't have a heavy accent, but I literally arrived in this country being completely muted. For those who know me, I know that's a radical thought. Mirna mute? Oh, what? It's not just like those things we carry with us from our experience. It's also the value that we assign to them, right? So I came feeling very self-conscious. My first sort of, if you will, sort of resistance against cultural norms, right? Like when my father, when I was 14, my dad told me, "Mija, tienes que ir a la universidad because with those looks, you'll never find a good husband." I literally left my country because I thought that I did not like that box on gender, right? That was my first sort of identity perception around like how I needed to flex power in a different way. And I came to this country and obviously just a completely different experience. I now try to think about all those contradictions and I carry them, right? You know, as how to find that as an asset to reach deeper. What do I mean by that? For example, the fact that I still am a fluent Spanish speaker does not make me better or worse than folks who don't, for all the reasons we're talking about, right? But it gives me an access point, especially to new immigrants. And I do a lot of media work in a way that helps connect with a segment of our community, right? That needs to be brought in. They're a lot further marginalized because of language barriers as well. And, you know, every day I remember that our identity continues to evolve. It's not a static thing. It's not a fixed thing. It's not a binary thing. Now, as a single mother, you know, my son is biracial. His father's Japanese. His parents met in the internment camps. And finding the commonality of experience around a critique of power and identity and belonging in this country has taken a new hue as I raise this biracial child, right, to feel included and seen in both aspects of his identity without feeling like he has to choose, and also vis-a-vis sort of larger dominant culture, right? It's so funny, like recently I went to school, and because we've been cloistered for 2 years, right? I arrived at school and the parents of the other band moms had no idea that I was Kenji's mother because they assumed he was Samoan because he pretends kind of Asian, but he's 6'2" and he's big and burly, right? And but his eyes, his face look Asian, and they were like, "Who are you?" And I'm like, "I'm Kenji's mother." I thought he was Samoan. Anyway, these things are amazingly I think of myself as a master code switcher. There are some aspects of my identity that give me access to certain rooms. Even when Kenji was really little, if I was dressed in my yoga pants in the park, people asked me if I was the nanny. If I was dressed in my professional outfits, right, we were going out or whatever, they asked me if I adopted him from China. Even to this day in our neighborhood, we moved into this beautiful house, and you know, I walked out to pick up my mail, and this female jogger walked by and asked me, how many houses do I clean and do I have room for another? So and I'm thinking, you know, it's a never ending aspect of how our identities evolve and we grow into them, and mastering our assets in service always to community is incredibly important, because reaching across those differences, having that awareness that sometimes those can actually be barriers to forming community is incredibly important, because we are not a monolith. Exactly.
Thank you all so much for bringing to light sort of that range and diversity of experiences and simultaneously the connection shared in identity, right? And sometimes connection through difference, right? Through diversity because of that, because of those differences, that diversity. You know, I've heard several of you elevate the importance of like advocacy, self-advocacy, community organizing, elevating our voices, and that feels so powerful. And I also know that there are a lot of non-Latinx participants in our webinar right now who, you know, from the perspective of accomplices, I'm curious, like, what would you want to share with folks from an accomplice perspective? What kinds of actions would you want to see from leaders, allies, accomplices in the field to support our community and the issues that that you all have been elevating in our conversation today?
Yeah, I would say first and foremost, to trust those most impacted by the inequity that exists. They must lead the change. Those most proximate to the issues know what's going on, and they have the best ideas and solutions, literally to solve our most complex challenges in education and beyond. And so we see in our work of family engagement, community organizing is people don't trust families or even open the door to hear their comments, suggestions, questions, ideas, concerns. So how do we change our mindsets and behaviors to have those co-creation conversations, to really listen to what the community is going through? Because guess what? That establishes relationships, trust, and respect that goes the distance. And once you have those relationships, trust with families, they are your ride or die. They're going to be there. Oh, you need me to show up for this? Oh, you need me to do that? I am here. But families don't feel welcome in the system for good reason. The system was intentionally designed to be the way it is. So how do we dismantle that? And as leaders of color and as white allies and accomplices, make sure that families feel comfortable, but in authentic ways, not in disingenuous ways, because families can sniff that out, but really invite families in to co-create, to co-construct with us, because families know they're not wanted. Families know the stereotype is families of color don't care, they're too busy, they don't value education. They feel that when they enter school. So how do we deconstruct that so when they walk in, they feel like they're true partners, their expertise is valued as their child's #1 teacher and advocate? So I'm really thinking a lot about that. And then for accomplices and allies, trust leaders of color. We know what we're doing, we're prepared to lead, and we need you to be alongside us and behind us as allies, and to also disrupt the white supremacy, racism, and sexism that we experience, so we are not undergoing constant racial battle fatigue and exhaustion and burnout of this work. So that's what I ask for from our allies and accomplices.
Push
I
people
think
on
one
the
of-
right kinds of measures. Push on people stuff they can control. Schools can rarely control the student data, but we can control the representation on our staff with our hiring practice. Push on metrics we can control.
I think for me is for each of us to be aware of the power of partnership with other BIPOC groups, right? The idea that we can support each other because we're really fighting against the same thing. And there's so many connections among our groups that we need to be cognizant of the power of that partnership.
I would say
Agree
that
with
we
that.
lift
We
our,
need to
our
think
story.
of it as communities of interest. How do we find that common interest?
Agree with everything, and just to lift our stories as part of the conversation around inequities and around racism and injustice. Sometimes we can get buried into the gray and in binary conversations, and just to continue to lift and elevate our voices and intersections.
Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you all so much for your time, your brilliance, and your very generous sharing. One thing I do want to elevate and acknowledge is that, you know, in asking folks to speak on your experiences and identities, you know, there is an emotional labor involved there. And so we're deeply grateful for the generosity of your sharing and your willingness to support our learning by sharing your own experiences and expertise. So deep gratitude for everything that you all shared today. And I also want to share gratitude to our co-sponsors, Latinos for Education and Unidos US, for their support in making today's conversation happen. And as we think about sort of the larger context of these conversations around diversity, equity, inclusion, representation, community engagement, you know, this idea of like, how do we create spaces for authenticity and true power sharing? We also want to flag that we have several other conversations on related topics around the report also coming up. We have one more week of webinars coming up next week. We'll have a conversation around leading transformation. What does it take to lead transformation within organizations? The role of liberating governance around the role of governing boards when we think about DEI work, and promising practices. What are the things our research points to as practices that support stronger DEI outcomes? So please register for any and all of the upcoming conversations that you are interested in. Additionally, if you think your organization could benefit from some support in advancing DEI within your organization, we are currently accepting applications for our DEI Accelerator. It's one of our cohort programs to provide an arc of support in partnership and in community with other organizations through this work. So please feel free to check out information there. I think Xiomara will be dropping information in the chat. And finally, we deeply value feedback, learning, input, co-creation. And so in that spirit, we invite you to please give us your feedback as we think about continuing these conversations, expanding these conversations, and getting more support for these kinds of conversations. We'd love to hear a little bit about your experience and your thoughts around what else you'd like to see as well. So with that, I will bring us to an official close and want to invite everyone to share our collective gratitude for Mirna, Nancy, Veronica, Devin, and Alma, and your beautiful sharing today. Thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the week, and to be continued. Thanks, everyone.